What if the thing standing between you and everything you actually want is something you've been told your whole life to protect? Your confidence, your pride, your sense of self. What if that very thing is quietly sabotaging your relationships, your growth, and your peace of mind without you even noticing? The Stoics figured this out over 2,000 years ago, and almost nobody talks about it. Today we are going inside one of the most overlooked yet most powerful principles in all of Stoic philosophy: the deliberate, strategic control of your own ego. Not crushing it, not faking humility, not performing modesty for social approval, but genuinely understanding what your ego is doing to you, why it is costing you more than you realize, and how mastering it becomes what I am calling the hidden superpower that almost every high performer secretly carries. Stick with me because this gets very real, very fast. Let us start with a question. Have you ever made a decision and immediately known it was wrong, but you kept going anyway because backing down felt worse than the outcome? That is your ego at work. Have you ever avoided asking for help because you did not want to look like you needed it? Ego. Have you ever held a grudge longer than made any logical sense because letting it go felt like losing? That is it again. The ego is not evil. It is not something to be ashamed of. Every single person has one. But the Stoics understood something that modern culture almost completely ignores. The ego, when left unexamined and unchecked, becomes the single largest obstacle to genuine strength, clear thinking, and lasting fulfillment. Marcus Aurelius, who was arguably one of the most powerful men who ever lived, spent his private journals reminding himself how small he was in the grand scheme of things. Not because he was weak, because he understood that humility was the foundation everything else had to be built on. He wrote to himself about the shortness of life, the smallness of any individual reputation, and the importance of focusing on doing what was right rather than being seen as great. That is remarkable. Here is a man commanding an empire, fighting wars, managing one of the most complex political systems in history, and he is privately writing notes to himself about staying humble. Why? Because he knew what unchecked pride does to judgment. He had seen it in others. He refused to let it happen to him. Now here is where this gets interesting for you specifically. You are already someone who values discipline. You already understand emotional regulation at some level. You are interested in Stoicism, which means you have probably thought more deeply about self-mastery than 90% of the people around you. But here is the trap that even disciplined, self-aware people fall into. Discipline without humility becomes rigidity. Emotional control without humility becomes coldness. Stoic philosophy without humility becomes intellectual arrogance. You can do everything right on the surface and still have an unchecked ego quietly running the show underneath. Epictetus understood this deeply. He was born into slavery. He had no status, no power, no possessions in any conventional sense, and yet he became one of the most influential thinkers of the ancient world. His entire philosophy was built around one core insight. The only thing you ever truly control is how you respond to what happens to you. Your thoughts, your judgments, your choices. Now think about what that requires. To genuinely accept that so much is outside your control, you have to let go of the ego's desperate need to be the center of everything. The ego wants to believe you are uniquely deserving. It wants the world to recognize your effort and reward your status. Epictetus said the path to freedom runs in exactly the opposite direction. Stop needing external validation. Stop tying your identity to outcomes you cannot control. And in doing that, you become untouchable. Not arrogant, actually untouchable. That is the hidden superpower. When your sense of self does not depend on winning every argument, being recognized, or maintaining a certain image, you operate from a completely different level of clarity. You can take criticism without crumbling. You can admit mistakes without your identity collapsing. You can collaborate without needing to dominate. You can walk away from what no longer serves you without it feeling like defeat. Seneca wrote about how many people suffer needlessly by comparing themselves to others, by needing to be seen as superior. He said the wise person measures themselves against their own standard, not against the shifting opinions of the crowd. That single shift removes an enormous amount of daily psychological weight. Imagine not waking up and immediately calculating where you stand relative to other people. That is what genuine ego control actually creates: space. Mental space for real thinking, real creativity, and real connection. Now let us get practical, because this is where philosophy has to become action. The first practice is what I call the pause before the reaction. Your ego moves fast. Someone challenges you, and before rational thought even gets involved, the ego is already defensive. The Stoic practice here is creating a deliberate gap. When something triggers that familiar heat of pride or defensiveness, pause before you respond. Ask yourself one question: what would the wisest version of me do here? Not the most impressive version, the wisest. That question alone begins to shift the internal dynamic. The second practice is voluntary discomfort with being wrong. Most people treat being wrong like a crisis. The ego turns every correction into an attack on identity. Start actively practicing saying the words "I was wrong about that," not as a performance, not with excessive self-deprecation, just clearly, cleanly, without drama. Do it in small situations first. You are training the ego to understand that your value as a person has absolutely nothing to do with your rate of being right. The third practice is what Marcus Aurelius actually did in those journals. Write to yourself honestly. Not for an audience, not for your Instagram story, just for you. Ask yourself where your ego showed up this week. Where did you avoid vulnerability because it felt risky? Where did you choose being seen over being genuine? The act of honest self-examination is one of the most powerful tools in Stoic practice, and it requires setting your ego down to do it properly. Here is the payoff. And this is what I want you to sit with. The people in history who built things that lasted, who led movements, who created work that mattered, who formed relationships of real depth and trust, they were almost never the loudest people in the room. They were not the ones constantly performing confidence. They were the ones who had done the internal work of understanding their own limitations, genuinely accepting them, and then operating from that honest foundation. Humility is not weakness dressed up in philosophical language. It is not a consolation prize for people who could not make it. It is a deliberate, strategic orientation toward reality. When you stop defending an inflated image of yourself, your energy becomes available for actual growth. When you stop needing to win every social comparison, you can focus on building something real. When you stop performing certainty, you become genuinely open to learning, and learning is where all real progress lies. The Stoics were not asking you to become passive or to shrink. They were pointing towards something far more demanding. See yourself accurately. Work constantly. Care about what is right over what looks impressive. That is harder than ego. That takes more courage than pride ever will. Your ego tells you that you need it to survive, that without it you will be overlooked, underestimated, taken advantage of. But the Stoics knew the truth. The person who has mastered their ego does not need the validation that ego is desperately chasing. They already have what the ego is searching for: peace, clarity, genuine strength. That is the hidden superpower, and it has been available to you this entire time.